My new neighbour moved in across the street 3 months ago. Her name was Eleanor. She was older than me, somewhere in her 70s, and easy to live across from. She kept her porch light on. She waved. She brought in my bins on the days I forgot. There was nothing strange about Eleanor. I need you to hold on to that, because everything I'm about to tell you will try to make you forget it. The first strange thing happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was carrying groceries in from the car, and Eleanor crossed the street to help me, the way she sometimes did. She took the heavier bag, and as she set it down on my step, she said something to me. She used a name, not my name. A nickname, a small, silly, private name that my grandmother had invented for me when I was 4 years old. My grandmother had been dead for 11 years. She was the only person who had ever used that name. It was never written down. It was never said outside our house. And I had never, not once, said that name out loud in this town. My new neighbour called me by a name my grandmother invented, and I remember looking down as if the step had moved under my feet. There was never much to tell about my family. At least, that was what we said. A small family, a quiet one. Nothing ever happened to us. My name is Margaret. I'm 46 years old, and I live in the house I grew up in, on a quiet street in Hawthorne Mill. I inherited it the year my mother Ruth moved into assisted care. My mother was not a cold woman, but she was a close one. She did not talk about the past. When I was young, I thought every mother was like that. Later, I thought it was simply her temperament. She did not look backward, and we learned not to ask her to. There were almost no photographs from before a certain year. I asked about that once, as a girl. My mother said there had been a move, a long time ago, and boxes had been lost. Why wouldn't I believe her? I was a child. It was only a box of photographs. There was a room upstairs that we did not use. A small room at the end of the hall, kept shut, full of stored things. My mother never told us we couldn't go in. She just made it clear, in the quiet way she made everything clear, that it was not a room for children. I grew up. I moved away, and then I moved back, the way people do in towns like this one. I took the house. I brought my small life back into it, and shut the door. And for 46 years, I believed I came from a family that nothing had ever happened to. So when Eleanor said that name, the problem was not only that she knew it. For Eleanor to know that name, she had to belong to a part of my family I had never been shown. I did not knock on Eleanor's door. Not at first. I was not frightened of her. It was something else. I had the feeling you get when you sense a room has been rearranged while you were out, and you cannot yet say which thing has moved. I did not want to ask Eleanor. I wanted to ask my family. So I drove out to see my mother. Ruth was 88 by then, and her mind came and went like weather. But she knew me, and she was glad to see me, and we sat together in the small warm room they had given her. I asked her about the early years, gently, where the family had lived before Hawthorne Mill, whether she'd had cousins, friends, people from before. And my mother, who was vague about so many things now, became vague in a different way, a careful way. She looked at her hands. She said it was all so long ago. She said she was tired. She changed the subject too quickly, like she had covered something with her hand. I had spent 46 years reading my mother's silences. I knew the difference between the silence of forgetting and the silence of choosing. That afternoon, in that warm little room, my mother was choosing. When I got home, I went up to the room at the end of the hall. I had not really looked in it in years. I went through the boxes properly for the first time in my life, and most of it was nothing. Old curtains, a broken lamp, the ordinary leftovers of a house someone had lived in for too long, and then, in a box beneath the others, I found a photograph. It was a family group, much older than any picture I had ever seen of us. 5 people, posed the stiff way people pose for cameras once. I recognized my grandmother as a young woman. I recognized the house behind them, this house. And at the edge of the photograph there was a 6th person. Or there had been. Someone had cut the figure out. Not torn, cut, carefully, with scissors, following the shape of a woman's shoulders and head, so that what was left was a clean, deliberate, person-shaped hole. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, was a list of names. I counted them. There was one more name than there were faces. The next morning I went into town, first to the records office, then to a law firm that had been in Hawthorne Mill longer than anyone could remember. Calloway and Sons. I asked about the history of my house. The deeds, the transfers, the paper trail a house leaves behind it. And the house, it turned out, had once belonged to a woman whose name I had never heard in my life. The same name, I would soon learn, that had been written on the back of that photograph, beside the empty space. There was a transfer signed that same summer, a date that would mean nothing to me until later. It meant a great deal later. That evening, I finally walked across the street, and I knocked on Eleanor's door. She did not seem surprised to see me. She seemed relieved, the way a person looks when something dreaded finally arrives. She made tea, and she told me she had been trying to decide for 3 months whether to say anything to me at all. She had not come to unsettle me. She had been afraid of reaching into a grief that she was not sure was hers to touch. Then Eleanor said the name from the back of the photograph, the name of the woman who had been cut out of it. She was my grandmother's older sister, a great aunt I had lived 46 years without knowing I had. Eleanor told it to me slowly, over a long evening. I'll tell it the way she did, slowly, and in the order I could bear to hear it. A long time ago, before my mother was grown, there was a child in our family, and one summer afternoon, at Hollow Lake, that child drowned. It was an accident. The kind of ordinary, unbearable accident every lake, town, knows about and never wants to name. My grandmother's older sister had been the one watching the children that day. Here is the part that is not an accident. Here is the part my family chose. Grief has to go somewhere. In a small town, it often lands on a person. And my family let it land on her. First, they called her careless. Then, when careless was not enough to hold all of that grief, they called her unstable. And then slowly, over years, they stopped calling her anything at all. They moved her out of Hawthorne Mill the quiet way. The way you move a piece of furniture you no longer want to look at. They took the photographs and they cut her out of them. And when the next children came, children like my mother, they were simply never told. Not about the sister, not about the lost child, not about any of it. My family did not survive that summer by grieving it. They survived it by deciding together that it was easier to lose a sister than to share a sorrow. The older sister lived a whole life after that, somewhere else under the weight of a blame that was never fairly hers. She married, she had a daughter, and that daughter had Eleanor. Eleanor grew up on the other side of the story, the erased side. She grew up hearing the nicknames and the name of the lost child and the description of a house with a maple tree in the yard. All of it told to her as the history of the family that had thrown her grandmother away. When Eleanor was old, and the people who would have minded were mostly gone, she came back to Hawthorne Mill, not to accuse anyone, not to frighten a woman carrying in her groceries. She came back to live for whatever time she had left near the place her grandmother had loved and was never once allowed to grieve. I drove home that night, and I sat in my car outside my own house for a long time. There was one more thing. I already knew it, and I did not want to carry it inside. My mother knew. Ruth had been a child when it happened, but old enough to have known the sister, old enough to remember a face before it became a hole in a photograph. My mother had not forgotten the past. She had been keeping it. For 60 years, she had been keeping the same silence that had been handed to her when she was too young to refuse it. The vagueness in that warm little room had not been her age. It had been the oldest thing my family owned. Still being passed down, still being protected. By an old woman in a chair who had simply never been allowed to put it down. I was not frightened of Eleanor. I want to say that clearly, because the story sounds, from the outside, like it should be a frightening one. What I felt was harder to hold than fear. I felt ashamed. For people mostly dead, for a thing I had not done, in a family I had not chosen. Because I understood finally that the secret had never really been about the child at the lake. Tragedies happen. Children are lost in terrible, ordinary ways, and no amount of silence has ever prevented a single one of them. The secret was about what my family did afterward. The secret was that we found it easier to lose a sister than to share a grief. And then easier still to forget we had ever made that choice, until the forgetting felt like the truth, and the truth felt like a stranger across the street. I think about that photograph more than anything else. I think about how someone in my family once sat down with a pair of scissors and decided a woman should stop existing, and how everyone else agreed to live inside that empty shape and call it peace. I went back to see my mother. I did not accuse her. She is very old, and the choice that broke our family was never hers to begin with. It was only hers to carry. I simply sat down beside her, and I said the older sister's name out loud in that warm little room. The first time, I think, anyone in our family had said it in 60 years. My mother did not flinch, and she did not pretend not to hear. She began very quietly to cry, not the way a person cries when they have been caught, the way a person cries when they have finally, after a whole long life, been allowed to set something down, my new neighbour never knew things a stranger shouldn't know. She knew things a family shouldn't have hidden. There is a difference, and it took me 46 years to learn it. Somewhere there is a photograph with a hole in it where a woman used to be. My family made that hole, and then we lived inside it for 3 generations and called it peace. Eleanor did not move across the street to frighten me. She moved there to put a face back into the frame. In the end, I was the one who was finally ready to look.